So it looks like we are all in from the waiting room. And so before I transition to Dr. Goodwin, just to give folks an orientation, this is the first webinar in a quick series that we're hoping to have that's being put on behalf of the working group. So the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, Maryland Department of Environment, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and Maryland Sea Grant came together to kind of scope out what this webinar series might look like. And we're hoping to build on this into 2022 and to also have this conversation and this discussion and any key takeaways really inform the working group actions of the next year to help keep Maryland moving forward. So with that, appreciate everyone adjusting their names in the participant list so that we know who's here. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Goodwin for some opening remarks. And then Rachel Lamb from MDE is going to help me kind of co-run this webinar today. And she'll be kind of handling some of the transitions, and her and I will be tag teaming. So any questions, drop them in the chat. And Dr. Goodwin, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Alison, and good afternoon, everyone. And a very big thank you for joining us this afternoon from the Climate Commission and also the Science and Technology Technical Working Group, as well as the Adaptation and Resilience Working Group of the Commission. So just to give a little history about how this came about, initially NDE and members of the Climate Change Commission asked a fairly simple question, and that was the folks at MDE felt that they were using a fairly crude method for accounting for the potential for carbon sequestration in the state's greenhouse gas inventory. And the question was, is that adequate, or would there be an improved way of accounting for that? And very quickly, as the discussion evolved, it was realized that the interest around blue carbon, as defined by, if you like, coastal marshes, submerged aquatic vegetation, intertidal marshes, there's many other interests in other elements of the state of Maryland in this issue. Whether it's preserving what we have already, enhancing the bay margins for ecological value, the benefits to water quality, the opportunities to protect infrastructure under the rapid sea level rise that we're experiencing in many parts of the bay, and also the experience that the state is developing around nature-based solutions. So all of these benefits were discussed, and as Alison mentioned, that couldn't possibly be covered in just a single workshop. So there is a sequence of 3 events. And I'd just like to thank Alison, who also represents DNR, the Coast-Smart Council, Rachel Lamb, Tasu Makuria, who are the Maryland Sea Grant Policy Fellows this year that have been helping make this a reality. Just as a final comment, what also became very evident as we were researching this was the incredible depth of expertise that exists in Maryland and the region. So many thanks for Dr. Olander for joining us today from Duke, and the many other experts that have been working on blue carbon that have really developed international reputations in this area. So we feel very fortunate in Maryland to be able to draw on this level of expertise. So with that, if you're in the field, you're probably also aware that the other place that people are looking at blue carbon is in the oceans. And I've been participating in a different workshop today, and I think that this is very recent, but the National Academies has just released a report entitled A Research Strategy for Ocean-Based Carbon Dioxide Removal and Sequestration. The number of that is 26278 in the National Academy publications. So the other part of what the state's looking at for the Bay. But today we're going to be focused on the intertidal wetlands. And with that, I'll leave that and just thank everyone again on behalf of the state, and particularly the Climate Change Commission, for your participation and sharing your thoughts, experiences, and expertise with us today. So with that, Alison, I'm not sure if I pass to you or Rachel, but the floor is now yours, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodwin. So I'm going to spend a few minutes with you here at the beginning of the webinar, orienting you to some of the key science policy tools in the state that we might utilize this science in support of improved accounting. Go ahead and share this here with you. All right, so it might be obvious to many of you here, but the two primary blue carbon systems that are of focus to us are coastal or tidal wetlands and seagrass meadows, or SAVs. A lot of scientific work has been done globally and, of course, in parts of the US to look at mangroves. But for us here, we're really looking at the state of the science in these two ecological systems. The primary accounting tool that we have adopted blue carbon into to date has been the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act plan. So, of course, the state of Maryland has a range of ambitious climate mitigation goals. And what we really increasingly want to do is ensure that all of our full suite of natural and working lands, including blue carbon, are represented and counted in that framework. So here is a brief table taken from our 2030 plan, where you can see some of our initial commitments around tidal wetland restoration and some of the annual carbon sequestration or the annual additional carbon sequestration that we expect to receive from implementing these restoration activities. So we have a range of different programs in the state. At least 3 of them are highlighted here, including the Coastal Wetland Initiative, which is really looking at restoring native hydrology. We look at the different kinds of projects that DNR's Trust Fund supports, including the support for the Natural Filters Program, and then a range of work that's being done by many of our federal partners. Now, one key thing to note here is that we're continuing to improve the science that we use to estimate this future sequestration potential. For the purposes of this planning, we used a default carbon sequestration rate that was provided by a recent protocol update through RAE and Vera. But this is kind of the foundation for some of our framing around planning. And you might think that this number in terms of metric tons of CO2e per year is relatively small compared to some of the other line items for increasing sequestration or mitigation. But of course, we recognize that a lot of these systems not only provide carbon benefits, but they also provide a range of co-benefits to support ongoing resilience and adaptation to climate impacts. So we want to think about how we can increase protection and restoration of these systems and do so in a spatially strategic way to really maximize those additional benefits and resources that they provide to us. Some of these are going to be familiar to you, but of course, we really care a lot about these foundational systems because they help reduce the impacts of storm damage. They can protect against erosion. They can, of course, serve as natural water filters and really provide support for a range of fisheries and nurseries. Another really interesting connection here is with seagrasses and the potential role of those seagrasses in buffering ongoing coastal or ocean acidification. And we know that they are highly efficient carbon sinks and something of increasing focus in the broader global conversation around offsets or other types of carbon finance systems to really provide more awareness about the benefit that these systems provide to our fight on climate change. So in addition to our planning and making sure that we are accurately capturing across a very heterogeneous landscape the carbon sequestration rates per year or the accumulation rates per year, and how those might continue to change into the future. We also are interested in capturing yearly snapshots in the context of an inventory. So currently our state greenhouse gas inventory is updated triennially with the 2020 update coming by the end of the calendar year and into the next year. This inventory is a really, of course, important tool for providing a snapshot on what's happening across our landscape and helping us evaluate how well we're doing relative to our planning goals. So one important thing to note is a lot of great work has been done to begin to include wetlands within the context of the U.S. National Inventory, and we've been working hard to learn from that work and think about how it could be adapted for the purposes here in Maryland in our own state inventory. What inventories try to do is capture a net flux. So the basic math, of course, is making sure that you're taking all of the ongoing gains from existing wetlands, adding in any restored or new wetlands, and then subtracting those that may be lost for a range of natural or anthropogenic reasons. And in particular for Maryland, we're really interested in our estuarine system and the wide range of potential salinity gradients that we want to include, and thinking about how those tidal wetland fluxes might vary across that landscape. And we're also one of the first states to really want to dig in to potentially including seagrasses, because of course, in the context of the Chesapeake Bay program, we've had a lot of investment in aerial imagery and accounting relative to those goals. And we're really interested in seeing how we can capitalize on that and include it in the context of carbon planning. Just to conclude here, I want to emphasize that the state and our agencies are really on the front lines of trying to identify and be a partner in shaping science-informed strategies for planning and for monitoring. We've been a primary collaborator on research with a range of universities and agencies, and are always looking for ongoing collaborations and partnerships. We also want to continue to position ourselves as a trusted partner in quantification, validation, and registration. That's particularly true for thinking about how this science could potentially be used in a carbon finance or market context. And Maryland already is deeply engaged in regional collaborative partnerships, such as in the context of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the U.S. Climate Alliance. So what we try to model here and how we're trying to include this science into our policy tools is something we want to be able to share and potentially amplify at larger regional or national scales. And finally, we have invested a lot in thinking about how to improve, for example, the forest carbon parts of our planning and inventorying, and we want to continue to do the same with all natural and working lands. So as we endeavor to do that with blue carbon, we want to continue to make sure that those accounting systems can talk to each other, and that we're trying to get as high resolution and lower latency, meaning trying to get annual or regular time snapshots of monitoring as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our great suite of talks today with a lot of scientists who are really on the front edge of helping us think through what the science shows us and how to continue to make it most relevant for Maryland.
So as Brian, Dr. Needleman from UMD gets set up and starts sharing his screen, because he's going to be our first up, I was remiss to leave out the breakout overview at the beginning. So you're going to hear from four speakers, including Rachel, and then we'll have a panel and then breakouts. And just so folks know, and you can kind of think about which breakout you'd like to attend, they're more or less going to follow the content of what folks spoke about. So we'll have a session on the basics of blue carbon with Dr. Needleman, and then we'll have a breakout on kind of the science behind inventories and accounting with Dr. Holmquist or McGonigal. And then we'll hear a little bit from mapping from Dr. Warnell at Duke, and then Rachel will have a breakout around the state perspective. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're hearing these presentations, and then I'll hand it over to Brian to go ahead and get started. And Brian, we are not seeing your presentation mode.
That work now?
There we go. Yep, you're good. All yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Allison, for inviting me to this webinar. It's exciting to participate. I'm Brian Needleman from the University of Maryland, College Park. And my task here is to go over some of the basics of blue carbon and hopefully share some insights along the way. So blue carbon is driven primarily by the very high carbon sequestration rates that occur in these coastal ecosystems. Carbon sequestration is the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and the storage of that carbon in soils and plant biomass. Just 1 second. And this, sorry, just moving. Sorry, okay, we can do that. So this figure shows various carbon sequestration rates about across different ecosystems. And you can see the estuarine wetlands just jumps out as having such an incredibly high rate of carbon sequestration. It's actually some data from an old report in 2007, which I like to use because that's when I first got involved in the blue carbon world. And there wasn't a lot of people talking about it. So it was, people were interested, but it really hadn't developed yet. So it's just remarkable how much progress has been made in 14 years to the point that we can have webinars like that with so many attendees. So in terms of coastal wetland ecosystems, Rachel mentioned this: marshes, seagrasses, mangroves, also tidal forests of wetlands, in some places mud flats, but they don't get quite as much attention. And why are the rates of carbon sequestration so high? Well, first off, you have high rates of photosynthesis, so lots of carbon dioxide being removed from the atmosphere. And wetland soils are anaerobic, such that you have slow rates of organic matter decomposition. And these two are not uncommon across wetlands, but what really kicks the coastal wetlands is accretion with sea level rise. You get increasing soil volume over time, which allows for this capacity for such high rates of carbon sequestration. Unfortunately, not all blue carbon is good. There's also methane emissions that occur from these systems. Methane is a gas that's produced in highly anaerobic wetland soils. It's a powerful greenhouse gas that offsets some or even all of the carbon sequestration benefit of coastal wetlands. It does vary by salinity, as Rachel alluded to, and it's pretty minimal in high salinity systems. So for example, on the Atlantic coast, for wetlands that have significant tidal exchange or getting lots of salt coming into the system, it's not zero, but there's going to be pretty minimal methane emissions. Problem is, from at least the blue carbon perspective, is that most of our wetlands in Maryland are not that salty. We have brackish and freshwater wetlands where methane emissions are highly variable and difficult to estimate. Now, it's an area of research that I work in quite a bit, and many people are. There's been a lot of progress over the past decade on increasing our ability to estimate this, but it remains among the more significant challenges in blue carbon science. Also need to mention nitrous oxide. It's often not talked about that often in the blue carbon perspective, but it is important. It's an even stronger greenhouse gas. The reason it's not spoken about as much is that emissions are generally pretty low in tidal wetlands. But they can be elevated in some cases, particularly those with high nitrogen inputs, which we in the Chesapeake Bay know all about high nitrogen inputs. So nitrous oxide should be part of the discussion of blue carbon. So blue carbon inventory in Maryland, that's something that Jim and Katie are going to speak about in the next two presentations. They're going to go into a lot more depth, but I just wanted to set the framework a little bit for the kind of questions that we want to answer through doing a blue carbon inventory. First off, how much carbon is already stored in Maryland coastal wetlands? Spoiler alert, it is a lot. There's a lot of carbon in those soils. Also, what are the carbon sequestration rates? How do they vary across time and space? And similarly, what are the methane and nitrous oxide emission rates? And what are the potential for blue carbon benefits through restoration, conservation, and creation projects? And lastly, what is the future going to hold? And this is something Katie will talk about in particular as terms of how this is going to change with sea level rise and other future scenarios. I also wanted to speak a little bit about generating carbon credits for carbon markets. So this is going to be the focus of the next webinar primarily, but I know it's of interest for probably many people that are on the call, and it's an area that I've worked in quite a bit. In fact, Pat McGonigal and I, who's going to be on the panel presentation, are one of a group of co-authors for 2 carbon crediting methodologies that are currently have been approved. There are others out there, and it's an exciting time for this idea of blue carbon crediting. It's very much an active ongoing activity compared to what was hypothetical for many years. One thing, I was pretty naive when I first got involved with this. I thought that all these wetlands out there that we know are sequestering so much carbon that someone would give us money for that. That is not true. It has to be some sort of human action causing a net reduction in greenhouse gases. And net reduction is determined by comparing the project with a baseline scenario. Basically, what would have happened in the absence of the project, also known as a business as usual scenario. And this is an important context to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about carbon crediting. It's a little odd that you're basically comparing the project to this alternative reality future scenario that never happens, right? But I assure you that there are means to do this, mechanisms to make this efficient. Don't get too put off by that possibility. Despite our best efforts, frankly, carbon crediting is very complicated and there's a large upfront expense such that you're not going to be doing a carbon project for a 100-acre wetland restoration. It's just not feasible. But a larger scale project, certainly, and in particular in the context of Maryland, you can group projects. So while you can't do it for 100-acre restoration, you could do it for lots of different smaller restorations that are usually in the similar type. For example, with the dredge material placement, there's quite a bit of wetland creation in Maryland that's being done through that method. A single one of those projects wouldn't probably work as a carbon crediting project, but grouping them all together, and that also includes the future ones. So that would include a project 20, 30 years from now. That's something that's feasible and doable within these systems. And the reality is that the price of carbon is climbing, the demand is increasing, and particularly blue carbon credits are considered highly valuable. People that are spending money to offset their carbon or their carbon emissions, they want to spend it on something that they can be proud of and advertise. And blue carbon credits are considered very high class. So some examples of carbon credit projects. The simplest one would be a wetland creation. That's pretty straightforward. You don't have a wetland, then you do. Not too complicated. Gets a little more complicated with a lot of wetland restoration projects. For example, in Somerset County, there's a planned restoration next year where a thin layer of dredge material will be sprayed onto a degraded wetland. Now, this is going to have presumably long-term carbon sequestration rate benefits, but it will need to be compared to this baseline scenario of what would have happened if the thin layering hadn't occurred. That's more challenging to figure out, but it can be done. I'll give you an example of something that's a little different type of project is reducing methane emissions. So this has nothing to do with carbon sequestration by increasing salinity. So just as an example, if there were some sort of impounded system that's creating a lot of methane emissions, and there was ecological reasons to introduce salinity into the system, it could have a dramatic decrease on the methane emissions. And this has some major potential for generating a large number of carbon credits. And maybe the biggest of all of them is wetland conservation that prevents the loss of existing carbon stocks through erosion and other factors. This is something Katie is going to talk about quite a bit. It's going to be well, some bad news from her presentation, but very important information that she'll be sharing with us. But from a carbon crediting perspective, anything we can do to prevent that loss has, again, tremendous potential for generating carbon credits. So with that, I will summarize that blue carbon is an important ecosystem service provided by coastal wetlands. There is interest, obviously, here in Maryland, nationally, globally. It's a very exciting time. Pretty much anywhere there's extensive coastal wetlands, people are talking about this at this point. Projects are actually happening. Rachel also mentioned this, some context that in most cases, blue carbon by itself is unlikely to drive both the rationale and the funding for most wetland restoration and conservation projects in Maryland. That says it is one of the many ecosystem services. Blue carbon is significant and fundable. And one important element of that fundability is that as hard as it is to find money to do restoration and conservation, because sometimes it can be even harder to find that money after the project is completed. And one of the kind of the niche funding elements of blue carbon is it has long-term indefinite, really, as long as that wetland is functioning after the project's completed, you can be generating saleable carbon credits. So it's potentially a long-term funding source for post-project completion funding. And just a little caveat that kind of who knows what the future holds as things develop and blue carbon science further develops. And frankly, as the price of carbon may go up even more in the future, there might be even more ability of using these blue carbon credits to fund restoration and conservation projects. So with that, I will say thank you. I'll share my contact information and a few citations. And that's a photo of my daughter enjoying blue carbon. So, so yes, I believe we're holding questions until the panel presentation. So I will, I'll pass it back over to Allison.
Thanks so much, Brian. All right, to keep this moving, thanks to those who are putting questions and that you need to do so. I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. Holmquist from CERC. Go ahead and share his screen. And he,
hello.
Perfect. You're good to go.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. And thanks in advance for listening to my talk. So I'm going to be speaking today about the science of the blue carbon inventory and accounting, and kind of highlighting on a few different projects within my research program that are trying to make progress on some of the improvements that are needed in the inventory process. So this is kind of at a I focus on a national scale, but pretty much whenever I show a map of the whole US or a region in California or Louisiana, just imagine like a little cookie cutter of Maryland, because a lot of this can be done, applied very, very easily to Maryland with just, you know, a few subsets or a few different changes in the way that we do the processing. So here we go. So yeah, 2018 was really kind of a big year for coastal carbon inventorying. It was the first time that the United States participated in a greenhouse gas inventory. This was aimed at the International Panel on Climate Change's recommendations that coastal nations report their greenhouse gas activities from the coastal zone. And the U.S. was the first, if not one of the first nations to achieve that. It was also the first time that that coastal wetlands were included in the State of the Carbon Cycle report, which comes out every decade or so. And that was the second State of the Carbon Cycle report. So these were, back when this happened, I was a postdoc at CERC, and I was working kind of alongside my collaborators here, Steve Crooks and Lisa Marie Wyndham Myers, and doing the work of not only doing the inventory, but also trying to figure out how to integrate uncertainty in the inventory, how to propagate it through, and how to analyze it so that we had a clear set of research priorities going forward, a clear kind of grocery list of research projects that could be funded so we can improve the inventory going forward. So this slide kind of just shows some of the data set that goes into the inventory. It's a pretty simple just multiplication, addition, and accounting. Obviously gets a lot more complicated when you start trying to propagate uncertainty, but essentially you get on one side of the equation, you get your emissions factors, which are your flux of greenhouse gas per unit area. And we get these by pooling literature values. So you can see here, there's a couple different types of methane emissions for different salinity classes, and a histogram for soil carbon burial, and there's probability distributions to show you kind of what the distribution of those values are. Then we multiply that by our activities data, which in our cases are just areas of different land cover types. So for the accounting, we kind of take 3 types of information into account. We look at land cover class. So we use the Coastal Change Analysis Program, which has about 20 different land cover categories, including 2 salinity classes of wetlands, 3 vegetation classes of wetlands, and all of the adjacent developed agricultural and natural land types. Then we look at land cover change, particularly between things like, conversions of wetland to water. That's like it's a huge emission. So, and then we look at then we make maps of where's kind of the cutoff of what we're considering the coastal zone. There's a couple different ways to do that. One of the ways that we tried in these publications was to look at probabilistic highest tide elevation maps, and to use that as our cutoff point. Like I said, I propagated uncertainty through all the accounting, and then did some sensitivity analysis to see, hey, what's really driving uncertainty, this inventory. What we really found was that methane, particularly methane from freshwater tidal wetlands, was just a huge source of uncertainty, and the inventory is really sensitive to it. There's a couple other things in here, like the actual soil burial rate. When you get losses of wetland to open water, the actual depth of the profile that gets lost, that's a big source of uncertainty. And whether you use, which conversion factor you use to estimate the equivalent CO2s for methane is a big uncertainty. It's more scientifically defensible to use the sustained global warming and global cooling potential, but the IPCC is guidance specifies a regular global warming potential. This is all kind of in the weeds stuff, but this is kind of the effect of a lot of these choices and data uncertainties on the inventory itself. A lot of the mapping uncertainties don't really come into account so much as these data uncertainties and the choices you make in the inventory. A lot of what I've been doing since then is taking the data that we've put together for this inventory and making it public. I've been doing this as the manager and now the director of the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network. This is a visualization of our Coastal Carbon Atlas, which is a way to visualize where people have collected soils data and to subset and download it. It's pretty it's kind of aimed at high-end users with a good amount of data skills, because it spits out just raw data. But we're also working through new projects on making outputs that are a bit more tailored to inventory compilers at both the country and state and locality level. Speaking of states and localities, we've also made some tools for visualizing the state of the data so far, and we've come up with this state level blue carbon data report card, which compares all the different states on just the quantity of soils data that they have available, the relative quality of it, the spatial coverage, are the cores really clustered in one place, or they spread out throughout the state, and the habitat coverage, do they over or under sample particular habitat types in that state. And I don't want to throw anyone under the bus or be the bad guy here, but I do say that Maryland has a lot of room for improvement in terms of getting more data up and higher quality data into the public databases. So yeah, I believe in you, Maryland. You can do it. Let's get this data public. So that's kind of the soil side of things. A lot of my work right now is also on trying to improve wetland mapping. So one issue that we have with the inventory is that the existing salinity maps that we have aren't really ideal for making a split between high and low emitting wetlands. So you can see that thick red line, that's what we have available. And you can see that, there's, and then the dotted line, that's kind of a more idealized split. So right now I'm working with NASA to improve our salinity mapping, and I've done pretty thorough synthesis of the available surface water data. And me and my team are trialing out a few different methods for using remote sensing or spatial extrapolation to create new salinity maps, and also to collect new data to validate those maps. The last thing I'll talk about is, pretty much my work so far has focused on this question of just what's there, fluxes and stocks, no matter the restoration potential of that wetland. But as Brian said, for carbon projects, you really have to have a management intervention to make it a bona fide blue carbon project. And so one thing I've been doing is trying to locate these particular types of wetlands where you can reintroduce salinity and then reduce methane emissions. These happen when you have impoundments, you have crushed culverts or culverts that don't allow adequate tidal flow, or you have actual managed water tables that were former tidal wetlands, but are managed to be fresher wetlands. And so I've been layering wetland maps that include these impounded features, looking at calculating new emissions factors based on the relationships between methane emissions and salinity that we do have, and using surveys and citizen scientists of the Citizen Science Project and the survey of people who manage these features, and trying to figure out what types of or how often can you actually restore salinity to this to one of these features. How often can you get it from a fresher to a saltier condition? And it's about a quarter of the features that we've mapped in the coastal zone of the U.S. And what are the kind of what's a weighted average of the emissions reduction potential of this restoration activity? So that's all I have today. Oh yeah, we're saving questions to the end, but if anyone has any written questions, you can contact me at holmquistj@si.edu.
Great, thank you, Jim. And we're going to hand it right over to Dr. Katie Warnell. She's from Duke University. She's going to be our last presenter before we move into the panel. So Katie, the floor is yours.
Take a minute to get my slide set up. Hopefully you can all see that fine. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm Katie Warnell from Duke University. I'm here on behalf of a much larger team, including Lydia Olander, who directs my program at Duke, Carolyn Curran at NOAA, and many people from individual states, including several from Maryland who I see on this call. So thanks to everyone who is involved in this project. Overall, we are mapping blue carbon, both the current status and the future effects of sea level rise. So just to kind of give a starting point, we are mostly, looking at how blue carbon and how habitats will change in the future. But to do this, we first had to start with a baseline and kind of pulling together an estimate of current blue carbon in Maryland. And we did that for 3 different areas. We looked at coastal marshes, seagrass or SAV, and we also looked at the low elevation, what we call the transition zone area. These are places that may transition to coastal marsh due to sea level rise, and this is identified using NOAA's marsh migration data. And so you can see in this map, and on the right and also in these numbers on the left, kind of how this breaks down in Maryland. So there's almost 200,000 acres of coastal marsh in the data that we used, a little bit less seagrass, about 56,000 acres. And then there's quite a bit of land, especially on the eastern shore, that's in that transition zone, a little bit over 200,000 acres. So for each of these areas, we combined information on the current extent of the habitat with carbon information. So these are primarily field measurements of carbon stocks and sequestration. And depending on the habitat type, we looked at different carbon pools. So for coastal marshes and seagrass beds, we were only looking at sediment carbon. There's a little bit of biomass carbon, but it's insignificant compared to the large amounts of carbon that are stored in the sediments. The transition zone includes several different types of habitats. So it includes things like freshwater marshes, wetland forests, some upland forests, as well as agricultural land. We estimated soil carbon for all of these habitats, and then we also looked at biomass carbon just for the forested habitats. And as you've heard from the last two presentations, methane emissions from freshwater wetland habitats are also, potentially large part of that carbon balance. So we did include those estimates as well, including for the lower salinity coastal marshes. So when we pull all that information together, we estimate that the entire coastal zone, so all three of those different areas, are currently storing about 73 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's what's currently kind of in the soils. We also were interested in seeing how that was changing every year as these habitats are adding more carbon, sequestering that in their soils and in their biomass for the forested areas. So when we add that information, you can see here the numbers for each of these habitats. So we get about 140,000 metric tons carbon dioxide per year that's being sequestered by coastal marsh. Again, less for seagrass, it's a smaller area, about 40,000 metric tons. And then for the transition zone, so that includes things like forests as well as wetlands, a little bit more, about 185,000 metric tons per year. So these numbers sound, pretty large. I always find it helpful to look at them in a little bit of context. So for that, we can look at the last version of Maryland's greenhouse gas inventory. And as you heard earlier, this is from 2017, and so it does not include blue carbon. It's exciting to hear that those additions are underway. But the net greenhouse gas emissions for the state were about 67 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So when we look at our current carbon sequestration by these coastal zone habitats, it's a pretty small part of that total net greenhouse gas emissions, only about 0.3%. But when we look at the carbon stock and how much carbon is currently stored in those soils, that's a lot more. It's a little bit more than the annual net emissions from Maryland. And so this really just emphasizes how important the coastal zone is as a carbon stock, and how significant it would be if a large amount of those habitats were lost, which could be due to sea level rise, due to human activity, many stressors that occur in the coastal zone. We really want to keep as much of that carbon as possible in the soils. But we were really interested in going beyond current estimates of blue carbon in Maryland and in other states to actually see what current research and data say about how both the coastal habitats themselves and the blue carbon functions will be affected by sea level rise. There's been a lot of research on individual aspects of this question. So for example, there's been quite a bit measuring coastal marsh elevation and seeing how that's changed in the last few decades along with sea level rise, and kind of extrapolating how that might mean that the coastal marshes will be able to adapt to sea level rise in the future. There's also been some work in ghost forests that are created by saltwater intrusion and what that does to the above ground biomass in those areas. But what we didn't see and what we wanted to do was to pull all those different pieces together on a larger scale to see what we could learn about the bigger picture effects of sea level rise on coastal habitats and blue carbon, and where the major gaps in our research and understanding are so that we can improve this in the future. So we did this for 6 states on the US East Coast, which are shaded in blue here, but I'll just be focusing on Maryland in today's presentation. But overall, the trends and the results that we see are pretty similar across all of these states. So first of all, sea level rise is happening globally. And this is a graph from a NOAA report where you can see the kind of thick black line is observed sea level rise, which starts to pick up around 1900. And then the different kind of rainbow of lines at the end are projections for future sea level rise based on different greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. So the scenario that I will be using for looking at results today is about 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, just over a meter. So it falls between the light blue and light green lines here. We also did some additional sea level rise scenarios for Maryland, which are a little bit lower. They kind of correspond with these lower blue lines. But since we have limited time today, I'm just going to focus on the one scenario for now. We can also see sea level rise already occurring in Maryland. So these are from NOAA tide gauges at 3 different sites in Maryland. And at each of them, you can see the sea level itself has been increasing over time. Some of these go back to 1920, some of them are a little bit more recent, but that's the blue line at the top, and all of those show a pretty significant upward trend. And you can also see this happening in nuisance flooding. This is also called sunny day flooding because it's just caused by high tides, not by storms. And so it's pretty directly driven by sea level rise. And these are in the yellow and pink bars are showing the number of days and the number of hours where we have flooding events occurring in these areas each year. And so there's also been really significant upticks in this sort of flooding in Maryland at the same time as we see these sea level rise going up as well. And the sea level rise is impacting coastal habitats already, both in Maryland and beyond. So the left 2 photos here are showing some effects on coastal marshes. So the top one is the kind of after effects of erosion in coastal marshes, which can occur as the marshes, if they're inundated too frequently and the plants aren't able to survive, then there can also be increased wave action that helps to erode that sediment. We also see in the lower photo that in some areas, marshes are likely to kind of slowly die off and convert to mudflats, which is shown in this picture, and maybe eventually to open water as the seas continue to rise. We also see inland effects of sea level rise. So at the top right, sea level rise and saltwater intrusion can cause tree mortality and create these ghost forests where you see some standing dead trees. But these are areas that are likely to eventually convert to marsh. This is kind of what the process of inland marsh migration looks like. And of course, all of these changes also impact people more directly. So the bottom right is actually a road under there that's flooded by high tide. And these photos are all from different parts of Maryland. So we were interested in modeling these sorts of responses to sea level rise, so how the habitats will change. And so we pulled together kind of different components, as I mentioned, different pieces that have been developed over the years, and developed this spatial model that projects how the extent and location of coastal marshes will change due to sea level rise. And there are basically 2 potential responses of coastal marshes to sea level rise that drive those changes in the model. So one thing that marshes can do as sea level rises is keep up with sea level rise, and they do this by vertically accreting. So they actually trap sediment that's brought into the marsh platform in the tides, and then they're able to add that to their biomass, and the marsh platform actually moves up along with sea level rise. They can also move up or move inland. So this is, again, marsh migration. And basically, as the sea level increases, it's inundating these new areas and making them suitable for marshes. And so we see that transgression, as in this photo, of the marsh into previously terrestrial areas. And the salt marshes can expand that way. But in areas that aren't able to keep up or are not able to kind of don't have room to move inland, we're likely to see marsh loss due to sea level rise. We also did look at seagrass or SAB response to sea level rise. This is a little bit simpler. Seagrass is really sensitive to lots of environmental variables, and so there are likely many different ways it will be impacted by climate change. The most direct impact related to sea level rise is just based on water depth. So seagrass normally grows in relatively shallow water, depending on the water clarity. And really what's driving that is whether enough light is able to reach the seagrass, kind of at the bottom there where it's growing, for it to actually grow. So as the water gets deeper, in some areas, the seagrass beds that currently exist will end up in water that's too deep for the light to reach them, and so they won't be able to persist. And this is the main seagrass response to sea level rise that's included in our model. There is some potential for seagrass to maybe be able to migrate inward into new areas as, you know, new areas are inundated, but we didn't include that because there's likely to be water quality issues in those areas. So you can imagine like excess nutrients and things in areas of land that are inundated. So we did not include that in our model. So I'm just going to go through a series of slides here that show the modeled coastal habitat change. So we'll start with the present day. This is the same map that was on the first slide and is basically showing the original coastal marsh in purple, the original seagrass in teal, and then the transition zone in yellow just is that whatever original habitat type it is. So whether it's freshwater wetlands or forest, those are all yellow right now, just indicating that they're still the original habitat type. And I'm going to flip forward kind of through time in 1 foot sea level rise increments from 1 to 4 feet. And we'll stop along the way and kind of describe what changes we're seeing. So this is for 1 foot of sea level rise. And you can see that some of the purple areas have turned blue. So that's original coastal marsh. I'm going to flip back and forth while I describe this. That's original coastal marsh that has not been able to keep up with sea level rise. Even with 1 foot of sea level rise, and therefore has drowned due to sea level rise. We also see a lot of the transition zone habitats, those yellow areas, turn pink. And this is indicating that they are now coastal marsh, so that coastal marsh has migrated inland into the transition zone. So that's new areas of marsh, and there's quite a bit of that even just with 1 foot of sea level rise. And then there's also probably not much happening right now, but some of seagrass areas will turn teal, darker teal, as we get into higher sea level rise elevations, which just indicates that those are places where the water got too deep and we don't project the seagrass as kind of being able to survive there anymore. So let's flip forward to 2 feet of sea level rise. So there's a little bit kind of an extension here. Similar things are happening with a little bit more of the original marsh being lost, some more marsh migration into the transition zone. And for the first time here, we're seeing some of these darker pink areas. They're a little hard to see with 2 feet, but you'll see them more if we flip to 3. So there's a bunch of darker pink areas. So those are parts of the migrated coastal marsh that are now have been lost because they were not able to keep up with sea level rise. So you kind of see this where there's a lot of opportunity for migration at very low sea level rise elevations. But as that continues, you will get some loss of that new marsh as well. So one more map here is the kind of final states. This is about 2100 with 4 feet of sea level rise. So here we've got, you know, almost entire loss of the original coastal marshes due to sea level rise. Still quite a bit of migrated marsh that is persisting in the transition zone, but there's also quite a bit of that migrated marsh that has been lost. So pretty significant habitat changes. And I guess flipping back here, we also, you know, this is a 4 foot sea level rise scenario. We did a few other sea level rise scenarios for Maryland, as I think I mentioned earlier. You know, the general trend, as you would expect, is that if you have less sea level rise, you have less habitat change. But I won't have time to show specific results for those at this point. All right. So the second half of this is translating these habitat changes that we're projecting into carbon changes. So there's a few kind of main types of carbon change that we're looking at that are linked to certain habitat changes. So if we lose areas of coastal marsh or of seagrass, that's associated with increased carbon emissions as we have sediment loss. So some of the sediments in those habitats are eroded and some of the carbon that's stored in those is eventually emitted to the atmosphere. We also have the conversion of terrestrial habitats in the transition zone to coastal marsh. And this can result in a few different carbon changes. If we have areas like a forest that convert to ghost forest and then to marsh, we have biomass mortality happening, so tree mortality, and that can increase carbon emissions pretty substantially in those areas. But we also have this new coastal marsh being established. And as you've heard earlier, these coastal marshes have pretty high carbon sequestration rates. We also have the potential for increased carbon sequestration in those areas. And then finally, we have some conversion of freshwater wetlands to coastal marsh with that saltwater moving in. And again, as has been mentioned by, I think, both of the previous presenters, that has the potential to decrease carbon emissions because it's cutting methane emissions from those areas as the availability of sulfate increases. So overall, there's kind of a mixed bag in terms of how these habitat changes will translate into carbon changes. Overall, just kind of giving you the snapshot result here, what we're seeing is that if we have about 4 feet of sea level rise, the coastal zone as a whole is likely to switch from a carbon sink that it currently is to a carbon source. And this is primarily due to carbon that's being released from biomass in the transition zone when we have forests and forested wetlands that are converting to marsh. There are, lots of other kind of pieces. All of the carbon pieces I mentioned in the last slide are playing a role. But that is kind of the biggest piece of the puzzle in terms of having really large carbon emissions happening due to sea level rise. And there are lots of uncertainties here. On the next slide, I'll show you some of them. We did run a bunch of different scenarios to try to understand better kind of which of our assumptions, which of our data uncertainties are driving big uncertainties in our final results. But across the board in all of the scenarios, we see that there's really a significant amount of habitat loss and this shift from a carbon sink to a carbon source. Just the kind of specifics of the numbers can change due to the assumptions. So to get into that in a little bit more detail, we wanted to, another reason for doing this work was to identify the major gaps and uncertainties. So we identified 2 sets. One set is just related to the habitat projections. And so some questions that came up and that are big uncertainties in our results. The first one is just what areas will be available for inland marsh migration. So in particular, there are areas like agricultural land and developed areas along the coast that are likely to be defended to different extents by people who use them or who live there. We're already seeing, especially in North Carolina, a lot of pumping of water off of agricultural fields, a lot of kind of trying to keep their ag lands in production, even though we already have some salinity intrusion problems. And then, of course, in places where people are living, in some cases, they've built big berms around entire towns to try to keep out saltwater and keep those areas safe for people to live. So there's uncertainties about kind of how effective those options will be, especially into the future, and given their expense, how much we'll actually try to implement them. But it's possible that that lots of these areas may not be available for marsh migration. Habitat salinity is another big uncertainty. This kind of directly translates into carbon through that methane connection. And as Jim described, we have uncertainty around current habitat salinity because the data that we have isn't really match up to what's happening in the marshes biophysically that's creating that methane. But then we also don't have a good way to project the changes in salinity due to sea level rise, but we can anticipate that there will be pretty big changes, especially in some of these kind of brackish and more freshwater coastal marshes as the sea level rises. And then finally, our assessment of marsh vulnerability to sea level rise is really based on their ability to keep up with sea level rise through vertical accretion, as I mentioned earlier. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, and some of them are not able to model very well. So some of this is as simple as having better data on marsh elevation relative to sea level. There's not great, highly spatially resolved data on that, especially working on a multi-state scale. And then there's also issues like local subsidence, where the land is sinking really quickly in some areas that we're not fully accounting for. There's also potential for movement of sediment within marshes. So sometimes you have things happening like there's erosion at the front edge of the marsh, but that sediment is actually moving further into the marsh interior. And so that can allow the marsh as a whole to keep up with sea level rise better than you would expect because it has this kind of self-sediment source that it's providing sediment to different parts of the marsh. And then there are also other impacts of climate change other than sea level rise that could affect marshes. So in particular, temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations can affect below ground biomass growth. And all of those habitat changes, can translate into carbon changes, but we also have a few uncertainties that are more directly related to carbon. And a lot of these actually line up with what Jim presented about uncertainties around kind of the current trying to get blue carbon into greenhouse gas inventories. So there's like kind of as simple as the carbon sequestration rates in soils and the coastal marshes and seagrass beds. There's a lot of uncertainty there. There has been a lot of research done in the US East Coast, but there's not always great coverage of different types of habitats. Methane emissions from freshwater habitats are highly variable, and we don't really have a good way to predict kind of that sort of geographic and spatial variability within given freshwater habitat. And then there's also lots of questions about what happens to stored carbon as habitats are lost. So that includes both soil carbon that's emitted from drowned or eroded marshes. So like how much of that soil is actually eroded, and then how much of the carbon in that soil is emitted to the atmosphere, and biomass carbon emissions from forest loss. There's starting to be more research here where they are seeing very substantial biomass losses in areas where we have ghost forests, but it seems to be kind of an emerging area of research. So lots of room for improvement in our ability to understand these potential changes. And I know, overall, this does paint a bleak picture. We are looking out pretty farther than I'd say most planning horizons at this point, all the way to the end of the century. And I don't want to leave with the impression that there's nothing to be done, or that all of our kind of coastal habitats are destined to be lost over the next century. I think there's lots of things that we can start to do to try to enhance resilience. So some of these focus on existing marshes and trying to reduce the loss of habitats and carbon as much as possible. Could be some of what you're already doing a lot of in Maryland. So there's beneficial use of dredge sediment to try to build up existing marshes, make sure they don't have a sediment deficit, and try to enable them to keep up with sea level rise as much as possible. We can also use techniques like living shorelines and oyster reefs to reduce the erosion rates of coastal marshes and help them better deal with things like storm frequency and that sort of thing that might increase in the future as well. It's also, I think, really important to bring sea level rise into coastal planning. And this could take the form of kind of lots of different discussions, but things that we've heard kind of starting to be thought about are whether we want to allow space for marsh migration and preserve certain areas to make sure coastal marshes do have spaces to migrate. And also just making sure that we aren't putting people at risk by continuing to develop in these really high risk areas that maybe are good marsh migration areas. And then also, as Jim mentioned, there are potential opportunities to reconnect these kind of impounded freshwater areas to reduce their methane emissions. That's probably the biggest kind of bang for your buck in terms of having these kind of defined area projects that would have a pretty big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And then the last bullet point here is just something that we've kind of started to brainstorm about, but there may be ways to reduce carbon emissions during habitat conversion. So something that's come up in other discussions have been whether we could do some salvage harvest of like ghost forest or forested areas that are very vulnerable to sea level rise and are not likely to persist, to try to convert that wood into harvested wood products where the carbon is stored for a longer period of time, rather than allowing them to kind of decompose in place and emit that carbon. So I'll wrap up for now. Definitely thanks again for inviting me, and looking forward to continuing the discussion. And thanks again to everyone who's been involved in this project.
Thanks, Katie. Sorry, I lost my mouse there for a second. We're going to transition right into the panel. We've been getting a whole host of really great questions. So Cindy can introduce herself. I don't want to mess up your last name. Apologies. So, but Cindy's going to serve as our moderator, and then all of our speakers, Katie, Rachel, Pat, and Brian will be your panelists. So feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat. We have a full 30 minutes for this, and then we'll move into shortened breakouts and then come back to wrap up. So Cindy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Allison. So I'm Cindy Palankis. I am at UMC's Horn Point Lab. Thank you all for all of your questions in the chat box. And also we had a few come through during registration. I wanted to start with talking about salinity. So there was a little bit of chatter in the chat, but we want to kind of make sure that we're all kind of on the same page with that. So the question came from Sally Orner, and it says, I was under the impression that the reason salt marshes produce less methane than freshwater marshes was the presence of sulfates as an electron acceptor in salt marshes. I don't see how increasing salinity would reduce methane production. So I was wondering if, everyone mentioned that this was a really important thing, the salinity and the methane and all that stuff. So could someone give us a quick primer on how salinity affects those methane emissions?
I can do that, Cindy. I'm covering the basics here. So that's a very good point. And yes, you're correct that it's the sulfate in seawater that we're really talking about. Generally, we don't have as much data on sulfate, so we speak about salinity since it's just much more available data. But every time we're talking about salinity in this, we're talking about sulfate ultimately. And it works that there's different microbial communities that decompose organic matter, and the microbial communities that can use sulfate tend to be able to outcompete the microbial communities that produce methane. So as long as you have enough sulfate present, then you're going to have very low methane emissions. That's only true though and again, these higher salt systems. So in the context of Maryland, we're really talking about the Atlantic coast. So most of our systems in Maryland don't have enough salinity in them that they're going to bring it to a real minimal level. But that doesn't mean it can't potentially lower the salinity, right? So, and there's some other important questions related to this, but which I think we'll get to. But what we've talked about a couple times is these idea where these freshwater wetlands are converting to a higher salinity, higher sulfate system, that there generally should be a reduction in methane emissions.
Does anyone else want to add to that? Okay.
This is Jeff Cornwell. I'd mentioned when you look at the balance of tidal freshwater wetlands to the brackish wetlands, the dominant pool of kind of wetland in terms of acreage and carbon storage is highly likely to be the more brackish and saline wetlands. And I've always had a prejudice towards the tidal freshwater wetlands because the biogeochemistry is so much more interesting. But in terms of area, the more boring saline wetlands that don't have as much interesting biogeochemistry, to my mind, of iron cycling and things of that kind, they're the dominant part of the landscape. And so you need to, sort of the methane issue may not apply to a really big proportion of the wetlands in the Chesapeake.
So just to clarify, so we found that somewhere in the range of 15 to 18 parts per thousand, that's really the threshold that you have to get above in order to get the really low methane emissions. And so most of our Chesapeake Bay wetlands are under that threshold. So unfortunately, we do, it's highly variable. So it doesn't mean that there aren't some of our brackish marshes that are producing low rates of methane, but it's not consistent. And we've certainly have some data of brackish wetlands that are producing actually very high, well, moderately high, right? So in terms of getting the real high methane emission rates, you got to go to the freshwater. But even in these brackish systems, it can offset 50%, if not more, of the carbon sequestration benefit. In some cases it's a lot lower, right? It's variable.
Okay, thank you. The next question came through at registration, so it's kind of open to anyone that wants to handle it. So the question here is, how does the net reduction idea work in understanding benefits of created wetlands versus established wetlands? Are we calculating ecological system sequestration or just the plant soils in the wetlands?
That may also be another one for me, unless someone else wants to jump in. So right, it's more straightforward with the created ones. In most cases, you don't really have to worry about what that scenario would have been in the absence of the project. With established ones, it is more complicated because you have to understand both what would have happened in the absence of the project and with the project. Right, so for established wetlands, yeah, so in terms of the net reduction, so I presume you're talking about the questions related to some sort of management practice, right? I mean, maybe another good example is prescribed burns, which is an interesting one. There is some evidence that prescribed burns increases rates of carbon sequestration. So, and it's a relatively minor management, intervention compared to a lot of other things. So if that were true and you increased prescribed burns in an area that didn't happen, that would be perhaps some slight increase in carbon sequestration, maybe, right? But that's a pretty subtle difference, right? So that would be a tough project to do because you'd really have to prove that difference exists, and it may not be that substantial a change. And then the question about the ecological system sequestration or just the plants and soils. So that's actually a very good and somewhat complicated question. The way I presented it was fairly simplistic with the basics is that, the plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and it's stored in plant biomass and soils. But right, when we look at the broader system, we also have movement of carbon. We have movement of carbon both into the system, for example, in sediment deposits, and out of the system with erosion. And ultimately, we want to and need to calculate all of those exchanges of carbon that are occurring, not just the more simple ones. So I would say it's the ecological system sequestration ultimately that we're looking at in the more complicated level of thinking about this.
Thank you. I'm going to move over to Katie just to give you a break, Brian. So here's a question for Katie. If water quality improves significantly, then would the marsh area increase significantly?
That's a good question. So that's kind of a level of detail beyond what we were able to include in our model. But I would say that there has been quite a bit of research. We know that water quality is an issue in many estuaries along the US East Coast that is likely affecting the health of the marshes. And so it's probably less likely to actually influence the extent of marshes and kind of the total area of marshes, but the health of the marshes, the functioning of those marshes, that's all things that can be affected by water quality. And those could certainly impact things like carbon sequestration, as well as all the other benefits, all the other functions that wetlands play, so like fish habitat, the density of plants in wetlands kind of translates directly into their ability to provide coastal protection services. So there's lots of other reasons, of course, that we want to have healthy wetlands and as kind of as much as possible. But I think that overall, the water quality is likely having a larger impact on the marsh function and health and on the total extent of the marshes.
Maybe I'll just jump in and add something there, which is the impact on seagrasses, on the other hand, is much more straightforward. And the methodologies for awarding carbon credits actually recognize an indirect effect of improving water quality on carbon sequestration in seagrass beds. So that's a place where it's easier to map the two together.
Yeah, so there was a question in the chat too about the seagrasses. So the question was whether there had been any restoration research or work on finding, altering, planting seagrass that could be more adaptable. In the model right now that Katie talked about, it's just the water gets too deep and then they die. But has there been any work done on maybe if they could migrate, or maybe we could have more tolerant grasses? You seen any research like that, or is that a call for research?
Well, unless somebody who's a seagrass expert wants to jump in, I'll say that I'm personally not aware of research directed at that specific question. The idea of, more temperature tolerant, nitrogen tolerant, and so forth, seagrass genotypes. But, there are people who are working on sort of natural selection processes within existing seagrass genotypes. And we know that there's a certain amount of natural selection that can change that equation a little bit. So that's really basic biology. I think that in terms of what we understand about seagrass restoration, there's a very successful example of that in Virginia. On the outer coast of the Chesapeake Bay, on the Virginia side, and there's been some very detailed carbon work done there to show that seagrass restoration can have large carbon benefits. So that's encouraging. And in terms of the seagrass just disappearing, I would add that one of the uncertainties there is whether they can gain elevation the way marshes do. We know that the bottom, the submerged part of the sediments can change in elevation as well. And depending on sediment dynamics, that would affect how sensitive the seagrasses are to sea level rise.
And just add, I have seen quite a bit of research on the distribution of different SAV species kind of globally and how that might shift with climate change, especially related to temperature. And there's a few seagrass species where kind of along the US East Coast, North Carolina, we're right at the kind of boundary where there's a northern elevation, northernmost extent of one seagrass species and southernmost of another. And so we're expecting to see those sorts of shifts, especially related to temperature. And so that might bring along with it other shifts, but I haven't seen the sorts of characteristics that were described in that question kind of specifically examined.
Yeah, thank you. And Pat mentioned the thing that popped to my mind too, is that we do know that SAV can sequester sediment. So it's possible that they could keep up in the model too, which would be fun. It wouldn't be quite so dire for them, right? If they were able to keep up a little bit. So what I want to sort of talk about next is move us into thinking about coastal resiliency. And so we talked about how we have a lot of marshes in Maryland that are sequestering a lot of carbon. And then we also talked about the fact that this crediting scheme is like based on how much we would lose if we did nothing, which it seems to me we would lose a lot. And the model showed that we would lose a lot if we did nothing. So it seems like offsetting these losses is maybe the best way forward if we wanted to think about making money off these credits, which maybe we do or don't. But we could use that partially perhaps as motivating, even more motivation for restoration. So the question here that came through is on that topic, just thinking about how we can use blue carbon resources to address coastal resiliency issues. So I'd actually like to hear from everyone, if you don't mind, your thoughts about how we can kind of use coastal resiliency approaches to get like double win scenarios where we're also increasing our blue carbon situation. So I'll let you volunteer in order rather than put anyone on the spot, but I'd like to hear from all three of you if you don't mind.
Well, two quick things come to mind. One is that there's been some work to combine multiple forms of crediting to compensate or give credit for those multiple range of benefits. So for example, we kind of discussed multiple pilot projects. There's some work being done in the broader Chesapeake Bay area to look at carbon and resilience crediting so that it might not fully compensate for the cost of perhaps a full restoration or wetland creation, but by combining the multiple forms of benefits and crediting them and in a stacked sort of methodology, it could acknowledge that array and perhaps make it a little bit more feasible financially. I think the benefit of having mapped or spatially explicit products and being able to project or model potential impacts of threats like sea level rise can help us be more strategic in where we are investing or investing energy and money in those projects. And I saw a question come through the chat that related to this a little bit. A lot of those offset protocols actually require you to demonstrate or discuss the potential impact of sea level rise on your project, because if you look at it next to, let's say, forest offset projects where there's a risk of reversal, why put a project in there if you think all of those trees, for example, are going to be gone within 10 years? There's a similar type of mentality where you're saying, okay, what is the potential impact of sea level rise? And we know from Katie's work, it can be kind of complicated because, the rate and where spatially those areas are located across the bay might, result in a little different outcome. But in short, to really think about investment, you've got to think about long-term planning. And I love the fact that this work is spatially explicit because I think it helps us be more strategic. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for co-benefit crediting to really acknowledge those resilience benefits alongside the mitigation ones.
I can jump on after that. I agree with what Rachel said. I think there's a lot of opportunity for kind of, well, as another co-benefit for the blue carbon projects and resilience projects to work together. And so one way to do that, as Rachel was describing, was to maybe look at, the sorts of assessments that we're trying to do and others to identify parts of the coast and existing coastal wetlands that might be more or less vulnerable to sea level rise. And there might be certain types of blue carbon projects that make sense to do in areas that seem to be less vulnerable. There might be other types of blue carbon projects like, that beneficial use of dredge sediment that make more sense to locate in areas that we think are more vulnerable to sea level rise, but where there's an opportunity to increase the resilience of those marshes and then in turn get all those other co-benefits, including community resilience, depending on where the marshes are located. So I think the key is just to really take this sort of information into account and not to assume that a project you put anywhere is necessarily going to be successful and to persist in the long term if you haven't kind of tried to incorporate that sort of information.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. I think most of it has been said well, but and also there's a question in the chat from James Wagner about sea level rise negating the value of carbon markets, value of coastal wetlands. So kind of seems like a mirage to him. The carbon markets giving credit for something that's not gonna be around in the future, while meanwhile allowing somebody else to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it's related to this question as well, because generally there's a permanence requirement for a carbon crediting project, that carbon is going to be stored for at least 100 years, which is a pretty long planning framework. And so the reality is that some of these projects that might seem great, we look at Katie's kind of work and we see that these wetlands aren't going to be around in 100 years. They will be rejected as a carbon crediting project. So again, like some of these speakers said, it requires you to think long term. If we were going to include the formal carbon crediting within the framework, which I think is important, because we don't want to create situations where we have this short-term benefit and that carbon is just returned to the atmosphere in the long run, and we haven't actually created a net positive overall.
Yeah, I agree. I think that question's been answered now, but one thing about these projects is that you end up searching for projects that give you the largest carbon benefit for the least cost, because at the end of the day, actually implementing these projects is expensive, and the more expensive they are, they're less likely to go forward for all sorts of reasons, but that certainly is a factor in projects that are done for carbon financing. And so for my money, some of the most exciting opportunities that have been mentioned already are, number one, providing the space for these wetlands to migrate. It doesn't really take any intervention other than, putting in place the policies that allow, that can control development along those migration areas. And then the other one is reintroduction of tidal flooding to impounded wetlands. And usually these are created by some kind of berm or impoundment that can be breached fairly easily. And because in situations where the salinity and sulfate content of the water goes up as a result, you lower methane emissions. Because of the large global warming potential of methane, the benefit of that from a radiative forcing perspective is really big. So fairly low cost, really big return. And, the kind of work that Jim talked about, mapping where these impoundments are and what the salinity regime is likely to change to if they were restored to tidal flooding, is really helpful for targeting where we should be putting investments, in my opinion.
I might just jump in on that. There was also a question about in what circumstances would it make sense to increase salinity to reduce methane, since it would have enormous impacts on the ecosystem. So I'll also add that as part of developing these carbon crediting methodologies, there was a lot of concern that we would be incentivizing negative projects that, yes, increase your carbon sequestration, but have negative ecosystem benefits. So there's some pretty strong language that strictly restricts that from, is not allowed, right? So in that example, that impoundment, if there were some rare endangered species or any other important ecological reason not to do a project like that, at least from a carbon crediting perspective, they would not be eligible.
Thanks. I also want to give space. I'm sure that you all have been watching the chat. So I think Brian already did that, and a couple of you are already done that, picked up on some questions that were in the chat. But if there's a question that popped up in the chat that you really wish I would ask you, let me know and answer it. So if anyone has anything like that they want to talk about.
Well, I'm happy to respond to Jeff's question about eroded carbon. And yeah, that's a fairly tricky one, but the way we addressed it in the methodology was to take into consideration the geomorphic setting where the carbon's lost. And if it happens to be a place that a passive margin or a place where the carbon would be transported and reworked actively over the course of several years, we assume that most of it would be oxidized and go back to the atmosphere. Whereas if it would be deposited on an active margin and buried quickly, we assigned it a preservation value of, I can't actually remember the numbers, maybe Brian does, some certain amount of it would be preserved. And we drew those data out of the literature, reviews in the literature. So basically that's how we addressed it. You have to consider the location where the carbon's being lost and the fate of the carbon in the nearby estuary or ocean.
And yeah, just to finish, it is not 100% return to the atmosphere, which Jeff asked, right? So it's and sometimes a fairly high percentage, but a lower percentage than 100%, at least in our methodology.
Yeah, it's never 100%.
Yeah, and Pat and I we're focused on the methodology we've spent years working on, but there are other methodologies out there. We should emphasize that and other approaches.
Just to finish that out, in our model, we use a more simplified version than what Pat just described. So interesting to hear about that geomorphic setting approach. But we estimated that 25% of the eroded soil carbon would end up in the atmosphere. So again, less than 100%, but that's one of the areas of high uncertainty in our analysis.
Anyone else have anything burning? And if not, I'll ask, because this question popped up and we haven't talked about it at all. And that is floating created marshes. So we've talked about, well, what I might say regular marshes, but native marsh. And then we have heard a little bit about creating marshes and how that might work. But what we haven't talked about is floating created marshes. And so are those included in these carbon accounting schemes? And if not, what would need to happen for them to be included, or maybe they're too small? So has anyone thought about the floating wetlands that are out there?
Well, I'd say there's nothing in the methodologies that would exclude necessarily a floating wetland. We don't identify specific subcategories of wetlands necessarily, only things about their soil stocks and sequestration rates and the nature of the vegetation, if it's woody or not. I think projects like that would probably be too small. And there's also the issue of sequestering the carbon. And it kind of relates to the question from Matthew about SAV farming as well. Carbon that's removed from the atmosphere by the plants and then ends up being returned back to the atmosphere because it's been fed to a person are left outside to decompose doesn't actually sequester the carbon. It cycles it back through fairly rapidly. And in a floating wetland, because it's suspended in a water column, my guess is you wouldn't sequester soil carbon very quickly in a setting like that. So the area and the rate of sequestration would probably both work against it, is my guess. In these tidal wetlands, like if you were to create a wetland on a mudflat, a major driver of the sequestration rate there is burial of carbon by sediment deposition. So sea level rise actually accelerates the rate at which these wetlands sequester carbon right up to the point that the wetland dies. So a floating marsh that doesn't get buried, won't have that working to its advantage.
Great. Okay, we're at our last question. And I think this will also help us think as we transition from this webinar into the next one where we talk more about financing. So this question is from Mark Stewart, and it asks, can any of the federal funding for infrastructure projects be used to implement blue carbon projects?
There might be someone from DNR, MDE that might be better to speak on that, but so there's no restriction for that from the carbon crediting methodology. Any human intervention is eligible at this stage. But I guess with the one exception is if it's mandated by law, right? So if you have kind of like, we don't really have this in the coastal wetlands, but like mitigation banking, those things, you don't get extra credit for doing that, but that's an exception. So really any sorts of funding is eligible. Whether there's funding out there that can help us do the projects, that would probably be a question for somebody else to answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure who here knows enough about the infrastructure bill, which I think that refers to. But I will say in general, this has been said several times already. A lot of the projects that you might want to do for carbon credits would not be financially feasible on that basis alone. Some will, many won't. And in that case, I think the strategy and the thought is that, well, even if you recover some of the money, that can help stretch a federal budget that would otherwise be supporting this kind of work, So we've got to always remember the co-benefits and think about the bigger good here and just see where and when carbon can fit into that.
There's a lot of money coming down the pipeline for the infrastructure bill related to ports and waterways and coastal infrastructure. I think very interesting natural connections to Maryland's emphasis on living shorelines and the way that we already are thinking about building and maintaining living systems as a source of resilience, and how those living shorelines can actually protect or enhance, or in some cases potentially create wetland or SAB habitat. So interesting to see how we might kind of think about accessing those funds in more creative ways to continue supporting the goals that we already have outlined as a state. And there's also a lot of money, of course, coming down for our major federal partners like NOAA and others who want to continue investing in blue carbon related, research and hopefully implementation as well in terms of projects. So I'm sure we'll have some good follow-up discussion on that at MDE as well.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and the panelists and Cindy for moderating. We're going to transition into our breakouts now. And so Rachel is going to put the breakout options up on the screen. And as a reminder, they kind of follow the content of the speakers that you heard. And so it is a self-selection process. Feel free to drop into any of the breakouts. And then we'll wrap up the breakouts at 2:55 and come back for just a few minutes of wrap up before the end of the session. And we have note takers in each of the sessions, and they will be just recording kind of key takeaways, not not recording names or anything. So feel free to speak freely. It's just kind of, we have some follow-up discussions that we want to have after this. So we want to make sure we capture some salient points. So Rachel, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'll see folks in the basics of blue carbon breakout if that's where you're going, because that's where I'm headed. I want to take a quick minute to just say thank you to our presenters and our attendees, and particularly to our presenters. I had a timer set for you all, and when I say you ended within 30 seconds of that time, well done. I don't think I've ever seen that happen for all of my presenters, so I was very surprised and appreciated that. This is the first of the webinar series. I'm going to put the links in the chat for the next webinar. One is next week. It's the financing, let me get the name exactly right, environmental finance mechanisms for enhancing Maryland's blue carbon sinks. And then we'll have a living shorelines workshop in January. So I'll put those links for registration in the chat. If you haven't recorded, they'll be run much the same way. The meetings will be recorded, and we're going to circle back to the planning team and get some type of summary document out, likely coming after the additional sessions, so that we can kind of bring it all together. And then if you have any follow-up, you can email me directly, or Rachel. And yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you. And then with a few minutes left, I did want to open it up to our breakouts, either the speakers, note takers, or attendees. If there was one really salient point, we have about 3 minutes, so maybe per breakout gets a minute. If there were any really salient points that came out of your discussion, to go ahead and share that, and then we'll wrap up right at 3 o'clock.
Well, from my group, I was just writing to Gray. I don't think we timed it real well. We introduced each other and then suddenly it was over. So anybody that wants to continue the conversations we started there, write to me, and we'll set up a time to continue that. That's great. One of the things we were talking about is how uncertainty folds into these carbon markets and what we need in terms of inventories to decrease that uncertainty. So that is an important thing.
I'll just throw in a couple of things we talked about in our session. I'm sure I'm going to miss some things. One was a lack of data for carbon sequestration rates in seagrasses and particularly freshwater systems. That's something is certainly a research need. And we also spoke about global warming potentials and methane, and how the time frame that you look at methane really depends on, really affects how bad it is compared to carbon dioxide. I think that's an important discussion. And gosh, what am I forgetting, Allison, that we spoke about?
I think that was it. There were just a couple of science needs identified, and questions that can't be answered just yet.
And in my group, we started to talk a bit about how, especially spatial information about habitats and habitat change with sea level rise and blue carbon might be useful in some planning decisions. So we had someone who's starting a project, it sounds like, to look at places in the state where it might make sense to do these sorts of vulnerability or blue carbon projects, or kind of marsh projects in general, for all these co-benefits. And so we also talked a little bit about uncertainty and how that shows up in the maps, and whether that could be useful in trying to find places that seem to be, relatively vulnerable to sea level rise across kind of all the different scenarios and across some of the major assumptions that we played with because of uncertainties. And similarly, identifying places that are less vulnerable and seem like they're more likely to persist into the future despite the uncertainties that are kind of constant across these areas. So those are the sorts of questions that we think this work will be useful for, but we also think there's lots of room for improvement, as we've talked about, in filling in some of these data and research gaps.
Awesome. So we are at 3 o'clock, and thank you to those who shared the salient points from your breakouts. And I just want to, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that there was a planning team that went into this and the entire series. So I've been talking on the logistics side for this webinar, but there was a whole group of people, Elliot Campbell, Tessu from UMCs, Dr. Goodwin, Suzanne Dorsey, Rachel Lamb, and others that I know I'm forgetting. We had some folks from Restore America's Estuaries and Compass helping us really scope out what these webinars are. So thank you to them and everyone who has helped us get this webinar series up and running, and hopefully we'll see many of you next Wednesday at the same time. Have a great afternoon.